For decades, I have been warning that the American foreign policy establishment was, through a combination of liberal hubris and strategic blindness, marching us toward a disastrous, unnecessary, and utterly predictable war with Russia. I argued, in no uncertain terms, that the flashpoint for this conflict would be Ukraine. I laid out the logic. I presented the evidence. I warned that if we continued on our path, the country of Ukraine would be destroyed. I was, of course, dismissed. I was called a realist, as if that were an insult. I was called an apologist for Putin. I was told the world had changed, that the iron laws of great power politics no longer applied, that we were in a new, rules-based era. And now, here we are. The tragedy I warned you was coming has arrived. The most significant land war in Europe since 1945 is raging, and the country of Ukraine, the country we claimed we were trying to save, is being systematically dismantled and destroyed. I take no pleasure in having been right. This is a catastrophe. It is a catastrophe for the Ukrainian people, first and foremost, who are the principal victims of our foolish policy. It is a catastrophe for Europe, which is now facing a level of instability it has not seen in generations. And it is a catastrophe for the United States, which has not only failed to achieve its aims but has, in fact, accelerated its own decline and pushed its two greatest rivals, Russia and China, into a no-limits partnership. In this documentary, I will not be polite. I will not mince words. The time for polite academic debate is over. I am going to explain to you, in the clearest possible terms, why this happened, why I was right, and why the mainstream Western narrative you hear on your television every single night is a dangerous, self-serving fantasy. This is the story of the fatal miscalculation. To understand this crisis, you must first clear your mind of the dominant Western narrative. You must stop thinking about this war in the way your political leaders want you to. This war is not about democracy versus authoritarianism. It is not a simple morality play of an evil villain, Vladimir Putin, waking up one day and deciding to recreate the Soviet Empire simply because he is a 19th-century imperialist. This is a profound misunderstanding of the cause of this war. And if you misunderstand the cause, you will misunderstand the solution. This conflict, like all great power conflicts, is about one thing: realism. It is about the cold, hard, brutal logic of great power politics. My entire career has been dedicated to explaining this logic. I call it offensive realism. Its core tenets are simple, and they are timeless. The international system is anarchic. There is no global government to protect states. The primary goal of every state is survival. And because states can never be certain of another state's intentions, the best way to ensure survival is to be the most powerful state in the system, the hegemon. In this world, great powers are exquisitely sensitive to threats, especially on their own borders. They will not, and cannot, tolerate another great power placing a military alliance or a troop presence in their immediate backyard. This is not about ideology. It is about physics. It is about security. The United States understands this better than anyone. We have, since 1823, enforced our own Monroe Doctrine. We have made it crystal clear that no distant great power, from Spain to the Soviet Union to China, is allowed to form a military alliance or place forces in the Western Hemisphere. We would view this as an existential threat, and we would use overwhelming force to stop it. We, for example, were willing to risk nuclear annihilation over Soviet missiles in Cuba. This is not a democratic or Republican position. It is a realist position. It is what great powers do. The fatal flaw of American foreign policy is that we, in our liberal hubris, believe that we are the only country in the world allowed to have a Monroe Doctrine. We believe that we can march our military alliance right up to the doorstep of another great power, and that they should, somehow, see this not as a threat, but as an act of liberal benevolence. This is the fantasy that led us directly to this war. This conflict is not about Ukrainian democracy. It is a classic, textbook case of a great power, Russia, responding to what it perceives as a direct, existential threat to its own security. So, what was this fatal miscalculation? What was this existential threat? It can be summarized in two words: NATO expansion. The entire crisis, from its inception in the 1990s to the hot war today, flows from a single, catastrophic decision made by the United States. That decision was to expand the most powerful military alliance in human history, an alliance created to contain the Soviet Union, eastward, toward a defeated and vulnerable Russia. Let us be clear about what NATO is. It is not a book club. It is not a trade organization. It is a nuclear-armed military alliance, run by the United States, with an explicit history of hostility toward Moscow. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia was on its knees. It was in no position to threaten anyone. A realist policy, the smart policy, would have been to manage its decline, to help it stabilize, and to ensure it remained a buffer state. Instead, driven by the ideology of liberal hegemony, we chose to kick them while they were down. We chose to expand our military sphere of influence into what Russia has always considered its core security buffer. In 1999, we brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In 2004, we pushed even further, absorbing 7 more countries, including the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, right on Russia's border. To the American establishment, this was expanding the zone of peace. To the Russians, this was a 5-alarm fire. This was a hostile military power marching directly toward their heartland. My argument, then and now, is not a defense of Vladimir Putin. It is a statement of geopolitical fact. You cannot take a military alliance and shove it down the throat of another great power without provoking a response. This is not complicated. And yet, for 30 years, the American foreign policy establishment has been in a state of mass denial about this simple, unavoidable truth. We broke the cardinal rule of great power politics. We ignored the security interests of a major power. And the fatal miscalculation was the arrogant belief that we, as the sole unipolar power, could do this and that Russia would be too weak, too cowed, or too liberalized to do anything about it. We were wrong. And Ukraine is paying the price for our mistake. This was not a mistake made in ignorance. The warnings were clear, they were numerous, and they came from the very heart of the American strategic establishment. I was not a lone voice in the wilderness. In 1997, as the first wave of expansion was being debated, 50 of America's most senior foreign policy figures, senators, diplomats, and academics, signed an open letter to President Clinton. They called NATO expansion a policy error of historic proportions. They warned it would undermine European stability and inflame nationalist, anti-Western sentiment in Russia. They were, of course, ignored. George Kennan, the legendary architect of America's Cold War containment strategy, was even more blunt. He called NATO expansion the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He warned in 1998 that it would provoke a bad reaction from Russia, and that we would then, foolishly, say, "We always told you that is how the Russians are." It is as if he wrote the script for the last 20 years. Even within the government, the warnings were clear. William Perry, Clinton's own Secretary of Defense, nearly resigned over the policy. He argued it was a betrayal of a vulnerable, cooperative Russia, and that it would set the stage for a new confrontation. Robert M. Gates, who would later become Secretary of Defense for 2 presidents, wrote in his memoirs that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. He called it a monumental provocation. My own role in this was simply to provide the theoretical framework. I argued, time and time again, that we were poking the bear in the eye. This is not a complex metaphor. You do not go to a bear, corner it, tell it you are going to arm its cubs, and then act surprised when it mauls you. The establishment, high on its unipolar moment, believed that power and realism were obsolete. They believed in a new liberal order where America could do as it pleased. They were not just wrong, they were dangerously wrong. They ignored every single warning, from their most seasoned diplomats to their own cabinet secretaries. This tragedy was not just predictable, it was predicted. For a decade, Russia protested this expansion. But they were weak, and their protests were dismissed. Then came the fatal miscalculation. This was the moment the policy moved from being merely foolish to being actively, catastrophically reckless. This was the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania. At this summit, the United States, led by President George W. Bush, pushed its European allies to formally declare that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. This was the moment the crisis became irreversible. This was the drawing of a red line that we, in our hubris, could not see, and that Russia could not, under any circumstances, allow to be crossed. For Russia, Ukraine is not just another country. It is, and has always been, the single most important buffer state. It is the historical heartland of Russian civilization. But more importantly, it is a vast, flat plain through which every major land invasion of Russia has come, from Napoleon to Hitler. The idea that this territory would become a forward base for its primary military adversary, NATO, was not just a threat. It was an existential threat. Putin, who was at the summit, reportedly told President Bush in no uncertain terms that if NATO moved into Ukraine, Russia would be forced to dismember the country. He could not have been clearer. Russia was telling us, directly, this is our red line. Do not cross it. And what did we do? We ignored him. The final communiqué of the summit was a compromise that was, in fact, the worst of all worlds. It didn't give Ukraine immediate membership, but it enshrined the promise of membership. It was a formal declaration of our intention. We had officially put Ukraine in play. From that moment in 2008, the fuse was lit. It was no longer a question of if a crisis would happen, but when. We had backed Russia into a corner. We had told them, flat out, that we intended to take the single most important piece on the geopolitical chessboard and turn it against them. From that day forward, Russia began to prepare for a confrontation, and it became Moscow's core policy to ensure that Ukraine would never, ever become a member of NATO. The 2014 crisis and the 2022 invasion were the direct, tragic, and entirely logical consequences of the decision made at Bucharest. The 2008 Bucharest decision was the strategic blunder. The 2014 crisis was the moment that blunder turned hot. For 6 years, the situation in Ukraine simmered. But in February 2014, it exploded. The Western narrative, as you know, is simple. In 2014, the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity, saw the freedom-loving Ukrainian people spontaneously rise up and overthrow their corrupt, pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, simply because he chose not to sign an economic agreement with the European Union. This is, in my view, a dangerous oversimplification. I am not here to defend Yanukovych. He was a corrupt and incompetent leader. But what happened in 2014 was not a simple, spontaneous uprising. It was a coup. And it was a coup that was actively, and enthusiastically, supported by the United States. Throughout the Maidan protests, American officials, including Senator John McCain and the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, were on the ground in Kiev, handing out bread and encouraging the protesters. They were signaling, in no uncertain terms, that the United States backed the overthrow of a democratically elected, though flawed, government. The infamous leaked phone call, in which Victoria Nuland was heard literally hand-picking the next Prime Minister of Ukraine, "Yats is the guy," is not propaganda. It is proof. It is proof that the United States was no longer a passive observer. We were actively midwifing a change in government. From Russia's perspective, this was the ultimate provocation. They did not see a revolution of dignity. They saw a Western-backed, anti-Russian coup on their most critical border. They saw the government of Ukraine, which had been precariously balanced between Russia and the West, suddenly and violently torn away and replaced by a pro-American, pro-NATO, and deeply anti-Russian nationalist government. For Moscow, this was the final straw. The 2008 promise of NATO membership was now being combined with an actively hostile government in Kiev. The threat was no longer theoretical, it was immediate. Russia's response, from my realist perspective, was not surprising. It was entirely predictable. They did what any great power would do when faced with what they perceive as an existential threat on their border. They acted. First, they seized Crimea. Why? Not because Putin has a 19th-century impulse to grab land, but because Crimea is home to Sevastopol, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. This is their single most important warm-water naval base. They could not, and would not, ever allow that strategic asset to fall into the hands of a hostile, pro-NATO government in Kiev. So, they took it. Second, they fueled a separatist war in the Donbass. Why? To ensure that the new government in Kiev could not consolidate its power. By keeping eastern Ukraine in a state of civil war, they made it impossible for the country to be a stable, functioning, unified state that could easily be integrated into NATO. It was a poison pill. This is the tragedy. The 2014 crisis was not the start of Russia's unprovoked aggression. It was the direct, predictable consequence of our 2008 Bucharest decision, combined with our reckless meddling in 2014. We lit the fire, and we are now shocked that the fire is burning. This brings me to the core of the Western narrative, the central argument you hear every day, which I believe is fundamentally wrong. This is the argument that the war in Ukraine has nothing to do with NATO. It is, they claim, all about Vladimir Putin. It is about his imperial ambitions, his desire to recreate the Soviet Union, his Hitler-like expansionism. This narrative is, in my view, empirically false. It is not supported by the evidence. It is a simple morality play designed to obscure our own role in causing this disaster. Let us look at the facts. If Putin were a relentless imperialist, driven by a master plan to conquer Europe, where was the evidence before we backed him into a corner? In 2000, when Putin came to power, he was not an anti-Western firebrand. He was, in fact, pro-Western. He spoke openly of wanting Russia to join the West, and perhaps even join NATO. He cooperated with the United States after September 11th. He was not an enemy. What changed? Did he change, or did his circumstances change? My argument is that his circumstances changed. He watched as NATO, a hostile military alliance, marched relentlessly toward his border, absorbing one former ally after another. He watched as the United States tore up the ABM Treaty. He watched as we promoted color revolutions on his borders in Georgia, 2003, and Ukraine, 2004. And finally, in 2008, he heard us formally declare our intention to absorb Ukraine itself. This is not a story of a random, unprovoked imperialist. This is a story of a classic security dilemma. Putin, and the entire Russian establishment, responded to our actions. Their aggression has been a direct, and predictable, reaction to our policy of NATO expansion. Look at their behavior. Did they invade Poland or Estonia, which are in NATO? No. Did they try to conquer Finland before it joined NATO? No. Their military actions have been hyper-focused on the two states that we, in 2008, declared would become part of NATO, Georgia, which they attacked in 2008, just months after the Bucharest summit, and Ukraine. This is not imperialism. This is a great power, as I have argued for 30 years, defending its core security interests. The West, and especially the United States, is the aggressor in this story. We are the ones who, driven by a liberal, revisionist ideology, attempted to change the balance of power in Europe. Russia is the one that is lashing out from a defensive crouch. To call this Putin's imperialism is to conveniently ignore the fact that we were the ones who provided the motive, the means, and the opportunity for this tragedy. This brings us to the battlefield itself, and the second great Western fantasy, the idea that Ukraine is winning and that Russia is losing. From the very beginning of this hot war, the Western media and political establishment have been engaged in a campaign of wishful thinking. We were told that Russian morale was broken. We were told their economy would collapse under sanctions. We were told their World War II military was incompetent and that our advanced Western wonder weapons, first javelins, then HIMARS, then Leopard tanks, then Storm Shadow missiles, would turn the tide and lead to a glorious Ukrainian victory. This was, and remains, a fantasy. I am a realist. I look at the material facts. I look at the balance of power. And the balance of power in this war has always heavily favored Russia. Russia is a nation of 140 million people. Ukraine is a nation that was 40 million, and is now far less. Russia has a vast, mobilized, industrial-age military-industrial complex that is now running 24/7. The West has a deindustrialized, just-in-time, boutique defense industry that cannot even produce enough 155mm artillery shells to keep Ukraine supplied for a single month. This is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the side with the bigger population, the stronger industrial base, and the greater resolve, wins. Russia has all three. The highly touted 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive, for which the West trained and armed 12 new brigades, was a catastrophic failure. It was dashed to pieces against Russia's sophisticated, deep, and well-manned defensive lines. The Ukrainians, despite their bravery, have suffered irreplaceable losses in their best-trained manpower. Now, it is Russia that has the big battalions. It is Russia that has the initiative. It is Russia that is grinding forward, day after day, in a brutal, artillery-led advance. And it is Ukraine that is running out of men, running out of ammunition, and running out of time. I take no pleasure in this. I am simply stating the facts as they are. The West, by encouraging Ukraine to fight a war it cannot win, by filling them with false promises of NATO membership and endless support, has not saved Ukraine. It has, in fact, guaranteed its destruction. We have, in effect, helped turn Ukraine into a 21st century Afghanistan. We have trapped it in a proxy war and are now setting it up to be a failed, depopulated, and dismembered state. This is the tragic, and entirely predictable, outcome of a war fought on liberal fantasies instead of realist calculations. So, what comes next? First, we must dispense with the fantasy that Russia will lose or that Ukraine will win. A win for Ukraine, defined as pushing Russia back to its 1991 borders, is a military impossibility. It is not going to happen. Therefore, the first part of what comes next is the tragic, but in my view, inevitable, dismemberment of Ukraine. This war will not end at a negotiating table where both sides compromise. It will end when one side is exhausted. And that side is Ukraine. Russia is now in a dominant position, and it will use that position to achieve its core goals. What are those goals? First, to ensure that what is left of Ukraine is a neutral, non-aligned state. NATO membership is off the table, forever. Second, Russia will annex the territory it has already captured and declared to be its own, Crimea and the 4 oblasts, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. It is a fantasy to believe Russia will ever negotiate these territories away. It has paid too high a price in blood and treasure for them. In fact, it is far more likely that Russia will expand its territorial gains. My assessment is that Russia will continue its grinding advance until it has captured all of Donetsk and all of Zaporizhia. It is highly likely they will also move to take Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city. And it is very possible they will push all the way to Odessa, to capture the entire Black Sea coast, leaving Ukraine as a landlocked, rump state. This is the grim reality. Ukraine will be partitioned. It will be a much smaller, poorer, and depopulated country, buffer state in the truest sense of the word. It will be a dysfunctional, failed state, shattered by war, and a permanent drain on whatever is left of European goodwill. This is the victory our liberal policies have wrought. This is the direct outcome of the fatal miscalculation. Finally, what comes next for the rest of the world? What are the grand strategic consequences of this disaster? They are, in my view, profound, and they are all negative for the United States. We set out on this crusade to, supposedly, weaken Russia. What have we achieved? We have done the opposite. First, we have strengthened Russia's strategic resolve and battle-hardened its military. We have given them a clear, existential purpose. Their military-industrial complex is now churning out more tanks, more shells, and more missiles than the entire NATO alliance combined. We have, in effect, remilitarized Russia. Second, we have demonstrated the limits of our own power. Our shock and awe sanctions failed to cripple their economy. Our wonder weapons failed to win the war. The rest of the world, especially the global South, has watched as the United States and its allies have been unable to defeat a single, regional power. Our credibility as a global hegemon has been severely damaged. But the single greatest, and most strategically idiotic, consequence of our policy is this: we have driven Russia and China into a no-limits partnership. This is the ultimate realist nightmare. For decades, the smart policy, from Nixon to the first Bush, was to keep Russia and China apart. We used one to balance the other. Our new, genius policy of liberal hegemony decided to make them both our enemies at the same time. By pushing Russia into a corner over Ukraine, we gave them no choice but to turn east. And China, our only true peer competitor, was waiting with open arms. We have now fused Russia's vast energy and natural resources with China's massive industrial and economic power. We have created a Eurasian Leviathan, a new axis that is united in its desire to see American power diminished. So, this is the future we created: a partitioned and destroyed Ukraine, a remilitarized and resentful Russia, a weaker and less credible West, and a powerful, unified Russia-China bloc that will challenge us on every front for decades to come. This is the true, and tragic, legacy of the fatal miscalculation.